Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. This episode is a postscript on the life and legacy of Anne Hutchinson, a conclusion that will also bridge the gap between her and Roger Williams. I want to take the opportunity to develop the aftermath of the controversies that we've looked at. And there may be some contemporary applications. I've tried to keep the podcast historical and refrain from too many contemporary comparisons. This one will have a few more than normal, and I hope that's okay. We'll resume the normal tenor next time. But this episode affords us the opportunity to close this chapter of colonial history out, mostly. We're going to quickly find ourselves embroiled in the first major conflict of the colonial era in New England, a conflict in their time that was already raging. Anne Hutchinson was not the only crisis that they were dealing with. What was to come would be a conflict that would forever change the landscape and the fortunes of many, many people. And so with that, turning our focus to Anne Hutchinson one last time, you remember in the previous two episodes, we've developed an overview of Anne's life and contribution to her immediate generation and those that have followed. And in this episode, I want to address two situations we didn't develop in the general storyline. A little more on the life application side of things. Not a soapbox, but more a series of observations and philosophical type questions. Working through times like these makes my head spin. Working through times like these, generally speaking, also helps me to make better decisions. I mean, what good are facts if I can't use them to my advantage? And it's also easier to lay the pieces out of a specific narrative from history that doesn't directly indict you, yourself, or someone around you, if they don't directly affect you, if they're more hypothetical than personally relevant. So these larger concepts are very broad, and you either see them or you don't see them. But I want to flesh them out just a little bit more. I want to massage them and present a few more angles to consider to build a more descriptive picture. More like the events of our own lives. I mean, usually only certain aspects of our own controversies are ever really worked through. There's either the prelude to find out, what started the whole thing, or there's the controversy itself as it takes on a life of its own, or maybe it's just the fallout as somebody's picking up the pieces. I mean, when you think about it, if you're honest, usually only certain aspects of the events of other people's lives are really worked through, the ones that most directly affect us. Our folks are right and their folks are wrong, and we miss the lessons, the nuances, the connections that we can make. It does not feel like we live in a society where we actually work through the specifics of events in our own lives to understand and learn from them. We seem to tend to justify and dismiss rather than digest and grow. We do not live in a society right now, it doesn't feel, where we're forced to wait for anything. It's hurry up and move on to the next thing. And it might be exciting, but it does not encourage growth. It sounds cynical, but how many people do you know that seem to repeat the same mistakes and have the same problems over and over without ever making necessary changes to stop the madness? How many government policies supported by the general public, can you name that never solved the targeted problem? How many people, including public figures, are destroyed in today's culture because of differences in opinion? Opinions formed from background or personal experience, and nobody seems to care. These scenarios exist largely, I think, because the people involved have never really worked through the basics of cause and effect. We seem to have lost the skills to actually solve a problem. I mean, heck, often we appear unable, worse yet, reluctant to articulate the root of a problem. Those are the best case scenarios. The worst case is that those involved don't want to solve the problems that they face. So, 2 points to work through. Both points revolve around the exercise of the freedom of conscience. Its repercussions in their day, and they take place within the context of chronology after Anne's banishment and after her death. If you consider the last several episodes, we looked first at the controversies and contributions of Roger Williams to the development of colonial New England. We've talked about the fact that his experiences not only had an enormous effect on the people of his day, but also the effect on ours. Roger Williams was a complex figure for his times. He had provoked multiple conversations around the ideas of what secular governance looked like, as well as freedom of conscience for the individual. He was ultimately run out of the Bible State. The culmination of his time in Massachusetts Bay seems quite dramatic if you think about it. He escaped. He slipped out of the reach of the magistrates just before John Underhill was able to arrest him, transport him to a waiting ship, and cart him off to England. He had escaped ultimately to what became modern Rhode Island. And from there, he remained an influential critic of the Puritan oligarchy. He was a Puritan in theological conviction on many levels, but was an even more ardent supporter of the freedom of conscience. He supported the acquisition of land and private property apart from state sanction. He spoke out against the state coercion of forced oaths from non-Puritans. He was a friend to non-Puritans like Baptists and Quakers. He gave them safe harbor in Rhode Island. Roger Williams felt that true religious conversion was more than mere words, more than forced state compliance. He was overtly sympathetic to the Baptist cause. My sarcastic and polemic take here is that he was a closet Baptist, although he never fully joined the denomination. Or he was a Baptist that was trapped not just in a Puritan body, but a Puritan society. He's a Calvinistic or a Reformed Baptist. He was an outspoken abolitionist from the very start. At the dawn of state-sanctioned slavery, he was there, again, to speak his conscience and convictions, even against popular sentiment, even against the perceived and declared necessity of the accumulation of human property for the advancement of commerce and economy. And you think about that stance, in light of what he had already been through, this was again an act of extreme courage on Roger Williams's part. He was a friend to the natives also. He was a friend to the Wampanoags of the Cape Cod and Plymouth area, and also the Narragansetts of the Rhode Island area. And make no mistake, Roger Williams was both a Puritan of sorts and an English colonial, having much more in common with the goals and the aspirations of his fellow Englishmen than the natives. But he nonetheless did enjoy good relations. He was as fair-minded as any Englishman was. So we'll pick up a little more of Roger Williams' saga after completing the Anne Hutchinson story. As I said, we left Anne just after her banishment, along with 30 like-minded families. The fact that she was gone from Massachusetts did not stop her critics. John Winthrop spread the word that the baby that had died, the stillborn child that had perished, was actually a demon. You remember this tragedy around the time of, and more than likely because of the stress and the circumstance surrounding her interrogation and trial in late 1636, early 1637, after her supporters had been summarily threatened and punished themselves. John Cotton declared the death was a punishment from God. Sadly, ruining her life, uprooting her family, grossly abusing her was not enough. Even after they had won, they continued to molest her reputation. It was said that in all of her years of helping deliver babies, she had never delivered a normal one. John Winthrop said that they were devil-like, clawed creatures. You remember, Anne had been a midwife in England and in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So when John Winthrop said that, that's not just an attack on her. That's an attack on all of the families and the children that she had helped over the years. And the antagonism continued. When William Hutchinson died in 1642, ministers, now let that sink in, ministers were sent to Rhode Island to intimidate Anne. They were to demand a recantation of her opinions and to scare her into thinking Massachusetts Bay was going to take over Rhode Island. That's just premeditated cruelty. I mean, that's great, minister. Let me hear your gospel, preacher man. Let me hear about God's truth and God's grace. How do you extend love to humankind? No, instead, they thought about it, and they traveled from Massachusetts Bay to Rhode Island and scared the crap out of this lady. So in fear, no doubt abject terror, And still struggling emotionally from the previous few years' experiences, Anne fled to New Netherlands and the security of the Dutch colony. And there's an inescapable irony here to me. I mean, a generation, maybe 2 generations earlier, what would have been Anne's father's friends, the Pilgrims, first fled England for Leiden for fear of persecution. And now their spiritual children were the aggressors. So Anne settled on the Long Island Sound. And in the summer of 1643, the following year, Anne's home was attacked by Siwanoy warriors. And Anne and 14 others, including all but one child, were axed to death and their bodies burned. The lone survivor was little Susan, 9 years old. She had been picking berries at the time of the attack and wisely hid. Now, the natives eventually found her and took her with them. And that would be quite traumatic. What did that do to that little girl's psyche? The loss of a sibling previously, the loss of her father, the experience of all of her mother's trials, the moves from Massachusetts Bay and Rhode Island. I mean, it wasn't very many years ago the Hutchinsons had been in England enjoying a pretty good life. That's a lot to take in for an adult, but for a child. And to now lose her mother and whole family, being there and hiding, but bearing witness to that horror. The sound of chopping and her screaming and the smell of burning flesh. No doubt that episode would have taken at least a little while and involved a lot of activity to perpetrate. And there was little Susan hiding in the midst of it. How many natives were present, I wonder? Enough to skillfully control and kill over a dozen people. I mean, what were those final moments like? What did it look like when she was found? What had happened to Susan's berries? I mean, that sounds silly, but really, what did that scene look like? Was her face smeared with berry juice from the previous, hours' experiences? Were her fingertips stained like most little kids? Did she have dirt, the mud, the dirt and the tears running down her cheeks? Had she soiled herself? Was she praying? Did Susan cry? Did she close her eyes? Did she pretend she wasn't there? Was there a scream of warning from her mom, from her siblings, as they were dying? I mean, what was said? What exchange was there? When they found Susan and they grabbed her, was it gentle? Did she scream then? Was Susan mute, just in shock? Was there ever a physical threat to her? I mean, did she try to fight them off? As she sat there, was she contemplating her own death? Or did they just kind of come out, find her, and scoop her up? Did they have to pry her out of the hiding spot? What did they say to her? I mean, could they speak English? What had their orders been when they attacked the house? Why wasn't anybody else spared? I mean, was there originally a plan to spare some of these folks, but maybe they put up too much of a fight? I don't know. A lot of questions here. But think about this one 9-year-old little girl out picking berries by her house one day when this happens. So she was adopted by Wampage, the chief of the natives, and he changed her name to Anne Hoek to honor her mother. So the natives knew who she was. She lived with the natives for 9 years before returning to Boston and ultimately marrying a colonist. And what was that time like? There were many stories of colonials and settlers kidnapped by natives who went on to live happy lives within those communities. And I'm guessing there must be some record that would answer some of the questions that I've asked, but the larger consideration right now for me are the questions, the fundamental effect this type of event has on an individual and what kind of a person engages in this activity once they've worked through the hypothetical. To the act of tormenting another human being, of being a terror, to what end exactly? Because remember, all this tragedy in Susan's life now was brought on by the hostility of John Winthrop and his cronies, their vindictiveness over ideas, the control of men's minds. Now, as a side note, there was friction between these local natives and the Europeans at this time. Our old friend John Underhill was involved in those hostilities. Now, John Underhill, he's the guy who had been sent to arrest Roger Williams. He's an interesting character himself, and we're going to talk about him in a couple of upcoming episodes. He's another one of those personalities that was intimately involved in many of the controversies of their day in several colonies, but has been largely edited out of the popular narrative. He was important, he was controversial, he was significant to English success in many ways, but he's not so celebrated by his enemies. John Underhill left behind quite a mixed legacy. So anyways, John Winthrop, in all of his grace, in all of his mercy, and all of his piety, celebrated Anne's death. He claimed it was an answer to prayer. She was, he said, an instrument of the devil. I guess that he was the one that really knew whose was God's and whose wasn't. Maybe that was his beef with Anne then, right? She had the gall to claim that gift, and he claimed it for himself. So as you can tell, I really don't have much stomach to offer a lot of latitude to John Winthrop in this particular series of events. It's not just that it violates my sense of right and wrong. It's more the violation of his own scriptures. He wasn't what he claimed to be. He's extraordinarily hypocritical. And he got away with it and was allowed in large part to frame the historical narrative. He penned an essay declaring Anne an American Jezebel. Now, if you're familiar with that period of Jewish history, in the days of King Ahab, you realize the abject hatred that he felt for her, completely distorting her memory. If the comparison is examined, even if you disagree with Anne Hutchinson, she was no Jezebel. I personally don't think that Winthrop was exaggerating his hatred. Based on his persistent, continuous attacks, I don't think this was hyperbole. And again, they violated his own scriptures. Do you violate your own scriptures, your own code of ethics? To what length do you justify your vendettas? How do the battles of your life look from a distance? Are they worthy battles or just senseless, petty destruction of somebody else's reputation? Justified character assassination or legitimate hills to die on? I mean, don't misunderstand me. There are legitimate battles in life. But do you know when to fight and when to lay down your weapons? I mean, how far is far enough? So John Winthrop and the others had literally ruined Anne Hutchinson's life. They upended her family. They caused the death of her child. They chased her beyond the colony. They chased her beyond the authority of the English crown. And they drove her to the circumstance of her death. I feel just fine pinning that on Winthrop. I mean, after all, he was the guy that was supporting the covenant of works. He was the guy leading the charge. So to that I say, nice work, right? There's your covenant of works, your promise of activity from John Winthrop himself. Nice work, John. Some might say you're being too hard on them. No, I think I'm being kind to the victim here. A lot of times we do that. We tend to give way too much latitude to the perpetrator and not enough kindness to the victim. So my point here is not to always be so quick to abuse your enemies or to hold them too poorly in your view. Don't dehumanize people, but rather use episodes like this to mark your own actions. Don't be a John Winthrop or even a John Cotton, as we had mentioned in previous episodes. Don't be a conscience denier. Be careful of forcing others to be conscience deniers. Don't be a betrayer and a hypocrite, a tool of personal destruction beyond what's necessary. I'd rather be a genuine martyr than cross my own conscience. And don't misunderstand me. I'm no hero. I have no desire for martyrdom. But we've all got that knee-jerk response at certain times in our lives. But in the end, calmer heads have to prevail. And if that's the case, I hope it begins with me or with you in those times. So if the legacy of Roger Williams had stopped right where we left him in our narrative before, if there had been a hard stop to his public contribution, let's say through death, the shadow of his legacy would still loom large in our society and collective conscience. But there's one more aspect to the life and contribution of Roger Williams I want to highlight. Actually, in part, in response to what happened to Anne Hutchinson. And in the end, we'll have one more shining example of the depth of conviction Roger Williams had, not just to his personal convictions, but more endearing to me, his care and concern for his friends, like-minded folks, who were abused and unappreciated. He was not silent. He spoke and defended the voiceless. If his arguments were reconsidered in our day, we'd see that he still does. The attempt at absolute fidelity to principle and consistency is a scarce commodity in our day, and I want to highlight his. There's one more thing to consider on this. There was fallout. There was a record kept. There was a challenge that was made. In the aftermath of her prosecution, banishment, and death, And this is where we pick up Roger Williams' storyline again, his extended contribution. You remember from our time talking about Massasoit several episodes ago now, that to me, one of the most endearing and courageous character traits is fidelity. And that goes both ways, being true to that which you have a conviction for, and trusting those intimate relationships in time of crisis or confusion, trusting those that you should trust, even when things look a little funky. That's harder to maintain than we like to admit. Another strong conviction of mine is the freedom of conscience. This portion of Roger Williams' story accentuates both of those character traits. So incidents like these served as a rallying cry for the war of words that ensued for many years between Roger Williams and John Cotton. Now, here's a disclaimer I want to tell you right up front. I have not read any of the books I'm about to quote. I'm quoting and trusting and relying on the accuracy of other sources. But in 1644, Roger Williams wrote The Bloody Tenet of Persecution, where he defended freedom of conscience and condemned religious persecution by civil authorities, as well as the separation of church and state. That's pretty meaty, isn't it? The Bloody Tenet of Persecution was a book written by Roger Williams where he defended freedom of conscience and condemned religious persecution by civil authorities, as well as the separation of church and state. Now remember, we talked about this book before. It was written in England when he was securing his charter for Rhode Island. And that was the same book that was banned by Parliament. And I can see why, when you think about it, what was going on in England right at this very time. They weren't exactly having fun with religious differences there either. This Parliament was pro-Puritan. They were leery of King Charles. They were leery of his Catholic wife. They were leery of Catholicism in general, and Anglicans too. The Civil War was raging. So anyways, that book, The Bloody Tenet of Persecution, was written against what Roger Williams originally believed to be a John Cotton document that was titled A Model of Church and Civil Power. Now, this title, A Model of Church and Civil Power, exalted the idea of civil authorities punishing citizens for religious infractions. So here's my translation, after knowing the end from the beginning especially. What it meant was how to build a society, how to build a social and political machine to control men. Williams saw the Bloody Tenet for what it was, or what that foreshadowed. Now, John Cotton had not written the manuscript, but he did agree with it. So he penned a response in 1647, the Bloody Tenet washed and made white in the blood of the Lamb. I mean, that's just great, right? It's one more argument defending abuse in the name of religion. The Bloody Tenet is controlling men, and it's okay as long as we've washed it and made it white in the blood of the Lamb. As long as you're abusing people using Scripture, it's okay. I mean, there's nothing like doubling down on your argument. I mean, let's Christianize bigotry and abuse. Let's not evangelize. Let's dehumanize. So I told you, I haven't read these books, but we can tell by the flavor of the narrative, the way this has gone the last several years in the late, great Bible state. The mandate that they believed that they had, the actions that they had already taken. I don't think I'm very far off in my assessment. I do appreciate the colorful titles that they used. So anyways, in yet another historical installment of Tag You're It, in 1652, Williams responded to Cotton's response to Williams' original response with The Bloody Tenet, Yet More Bloody, by Mr. Cotton's endeavor to wash it white in the blood of the Lamb. So basically, Mr. Cotton has made an excuse for abusing people under his control, i.e. the antinomian controversy. I mean, just the titles here are laced with some very colorful venom. Both sides were emboldened by their own literature and hardened by the others. That sounds very familiar, doesn't it? It sounds very contemporary. That both sides were emboldened by their own literature and hardened by the opposing view. The result of this divide was that if you sided with the Boston folks, you went to Boston or Massachusetts Bay or Plymouth. And if you sided with Roger Williams, you went to Providence or Portsmouth or New Hampshire. And as a reminder, one focus of this podcast is how the 13 colonies managed to unite in the 1770s. And you see the division already among largely like-minded folks. Now, this situation did eventually correct itself. With each successive generation, over time, the organization and the structure of the strict Bible state gave way to leniency. The people grew tired under the weight of the legalism. They grew disinterested. They began to raise the same questions as Williams and Hutchinson had. And other groups did begin to gain a foothold. Life was getting easier, and the necessity for that strict, lockstep progress gave way. It's an awful situation, awful environment to live in. Remember when I told you about the Puritan publisher that didn't want to discuss Nathaniel Hawthorne? I can't help but think this was the kind of embarrassing bullshit he didn't want to have to address. I wouldn't have addressed it there. That wasn't the venue for that. I just wanted to know what his general opinion was. It's a sad commentary, really. It seemed not enough to oppose someone in the public arena of ideas, nor was it enough to ruin a person's life. It seems it had become sanctimonious to destroy everything about a person's humanity. It reminds me of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, or Herman Melville's Billy Budd Sailor, or worse and more relevant here, Nathaniel Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown, or The Minister's Black Veil, the kinds of general overviews of human nature we all find easy to pin on others, and then, having considered it a little bit more, uncomfortably recognizing ourselves in those illustrations, not necessarily as the victims, but the victors, not the cruelly molested, but the cruel molesters. Is that too much? Take a good look at the society that we live in. Who are we becoming? It's not just a really cool subject. This story hits close to home for me. The subjects of history and philosophy and politics and theology and the sentiments of fidelity and courage and betrayal and victory and failure and the battles and the consequences of ideas. Those were tough times. The controversies were multifaceted and complex. And so too are our times and this generation's controversies. Well, I hope this combination of relationship and conclusion and application has been a help in opening up the depth of the situation and the controversies around both Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. Their stories are amazing in themselves. They were really extraordinary people. I can't help but notice so many parallels to our own contemporary issues. And as I've said before, I'm trying to stay away from too many direct comparisons between our narrative and contemporary culture, but these situations struck too much of a chord within me to avoid. Well, if I was able to present this information correctly, the way I hoped, you're a little uneasy. Or you will be as soon as you start to digest the episode. I'm uneasy about some of the things that it suggests and some of the thoughts that it spurs in me. It's a good uneasy, though. It causes me to tread a little lighter, to be a little easier on common everyday people. And oddly, at the same time, it encourages me to harden my resolve on certain convictions. It encourages me to be a little more thoughtful about which hills I choose to die on. It encourages me to be a little more careful about the hills that I choose to shed blood on. As I've teased out a few times, the situation around Anne Hutchinson did not play itself out in a bubble. The world was moving very quickly for the Puritans. In Europe, the 30 Years' War was raging. We touched on that a little in a previous episode. In the colonies of New England, there was another war that was raging at the time of the Antinomian controversy. And again, when Roger Williams took up the pen to combat the emerging and ever-codified Puritan societal blueprint. Their apologies for their view of society in the 1640s, and there would be fallout. And we'll cover those events in the course of time as the chronology affords it. But in the immediate future, my plan is to have a couple of smaller bonus-type episodes. I don't know that they'll be that short, but kind of sidetracked from getting to the next series, more biographical to help introduce the Pequot War. There's people and there's people groups that we want to make sure we understand before we jump headlong into that series of events. And those biographies are for another day. But I hope the closure of the biographies today have not just been an exercise in historical facts or philosophy or opinionated commentary, but really helped the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com. and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.